If you're somebody who struggles with binge eating or emotional eating, or you've ever tried to lose weight or eat a little bit healthier, chances are there are certain foods that you try really hard just to completely stay away from. Because when those foods do inevitably end up in your house, even though you may try to only have one serving a day, you just can't help but go back for more and more until the best course of action feels like you should just eat the rest of it to get it out of the house. And when you have these experiences over and over and over again, it really builds the case that you can't be trusted, and the only safe thing to do is to ban these foods from your life for good. But unfortunately, no matter how hard you try to maintain a pristine food environment, foods like this just somehow manage to creep their way in a lot more often than you'd like. So in this video, let's break down why this is happening, what you might be doing to perpetuate this cycle, and also what you can do to break the cycle for good. And I will say right now that the solution is a little bit radical, but trust me, it is very effective. So people get stuck into this cycle for a couple of reasons. The first reason is just a basic economic principle, and that is that scarcity increases value. So when you decide that you should stop eating a certain food, it elevates the value of that food because that food has now become scarce. You're more likely to eat a lot more of that food, take advantage of the fact that you have access when you usually don't have access to it. And you can see this dynamic in a lot of other domains outside of diet culture. In fact, this is pretty much the business model of Trader Joe's. They only have certain seasonal products certain times of year, and then they pull those items from the shelf. And so when those foods become available, people will stock up on them and hoard them because they don't know when they're going to get them again. And we do the same thing with holiday food and with travel. If there is a food that is typically not available throughout the year and you're only going to have access to it at a specific time, you are a lot more likely to want to eat a lot of it in order to get the full beneficial experience before that opportunity window closes. And largely this dynamic is really not that harmful in those contexts because you're not traveling on vacation all the time, you're not having holidays all the time. But when it comes to diet culture, it becomes really harmful because we don't have an external source limiting our access to certain foods. That control is self-imposed, and the access is typically a lot more frequent as a result of that. So let me show you how this works using cookies as an example. If I were to tell you that you can never, ever, ever have cookies ever again, what would you instantly think about doing? Probably eating cookies. And let's say that you were going to institute that new rule. You were going to say, starting tomorrow, I'm never going to have cookies again. What would you probably do the night before that rule went into effect? You'd probably eat a whole lot of cookies because you don't know when you're going to have access again. In your mind, the next time you're going to have cookies is never. And so you would be a fool not to take advantage of the opportunity to have cookies this one last time. You would also be a fool to not eat a lot of them. And so the more that you say never again, never again, never again, the higher and higher and higher the value of that food rises. But in all honesty, that food is probably not actually scarce. And so unlike a special product at Trader Joe's, the access to cookies is actually not going to go away, but in your mind, it is. And so when the opportunity to have cookies comes up again, and it absolutely will, at a party, at a potluck, maybe you decide to get some cookies on the way home because you had a rough day, your brain is going to tell you a few things. 1, this is an incredibly valuable food. 2, this is probably my only opportunity to have this incredibly valuable food. And once this window closes, that's it. We're never having it again. And in that context, a binge is incredibly likely. And it's often not just one trigger food that will get binged on. When we say something like never again or starting tomorrow, I'm going to be perfect, we are not just creating scarcity for cookies. We're also creating scarcity for every other trigger food that we may have. And so if the diet starts tomorrow, then we may as well take full advantage of the fact that it's open season and that window is open. And so people will often binge multiple foods, not just the one food that they suddenly have access to. And this is what leads to something called a binge and restrict cycle, where somebody will eat a lot of hyper-palatable, pleasurable trigger foods. And then as a result of that, they will go into deprivation mode, where they will eat clean, they will do a cleanse, they might do fasting, and they try to be extra, extra, extra good the next day or moving forward after that point. But again, this sets up the scarcity that caused the binge in the first place. And when this binge and restrict cycle repeats over and over and over again, it provides a lot of evidence to us that this is a problem that we have that is core to our identity as a person. I am somebody who has no control around food. I am somebody who has no willpower. I am somebody with a food addiction. And when you integrate these cycles into your identity, you have the very strong belief that these cycles are inevitable. And so often when people have internalized these cycles so much that they feel hopeless against them, when they go out and buy one of their trigger foods, let's say ice cream or cookies, the intention from the start is that they're going to eat the whole thing because they always have. And that's when we get truly stuck. And so, all of this in mind, the things that are keeping this cycle going and the things that are keeping you stuck are one, the continued assumption that ideally the amount of these trigger foods that you would consume moving forward is none. And two, when you do have these foods, continuing to tell yourself that starting tomorrow you'll be extra good, or that moving forward you will never have these foods again. Which brings us to our radical solution, and that is don't make foods like this scarce in your life. Commit to having things like this in your house all the time and consuming them on a semi-regular basis. It sounds nuts, I know, but before you click away and go, geez, this lady is absolutely crazy, or this is just not going to work for me, hear me out, because I have seen this work for countless clients and I have even been through this process myself. So let me walk you through how this works and what you can expect if you give this a try using me as an example. Many people assume that because I'm a registered dietitian, I have always had my shit figured out when it comes to food, but trust me, I've been there. I used to have a whole list of foods that I couldn't keep in the house because I just couldn't trust myself around them. And maintaining that rigidity and abstaining was something that I patted myself on the back for. But abstaining from these foods that I really enjoy most of the time and then binging on them big time whenever I got my paws on them was not an example of a good and comfortable relationship with food. And so over the years, I have slowly built comfort with all of my trigger foods so that now I can keep any of them in the house at any time and not worry that I'm going to binge on them. One of the foods that I worked really hard on building comfort with was mayonnaise, or veganese because I'm vegan. I'm first generation American from Belgium, and growing up we put mayonnaise on pretty much everything, and it is one of my absolute favorite foods. But one day somewhere along the line I decided that mayonnaise was not good for me, and it was really important for me to cut it out of my life. And over time my fixation with mayonnaise got more and more intense to the point that if I ever let one get into my house, I was probably going to eat the entire jar within a day or two. I would put mayonnaise on everything. I'd put mayonnaise on pasta, on vegetables, on toast. Guys, I would even eat this with a spoon. And so I decided that enough is enough and I need to make peace with mayonnaise because I love it. Do I want to live a life where I can't have any mayonnaise? No. So what I did is I committed to always having a jar of mayonnaise in my house at all times. So unsurprisingly, when I got that first jar of mayonnaise, I binged on it. I finished that jar in about 24 hours. So I went right out and I bought another jar of mayonnaise and I finished that in probably 2 days. And I would say that I went through a lot of mayonnaise in about 2 weeks. And then at a certain point, I realized I don't want everything that I eat to taste like mayonnaise. I want other flavors. I do love mayonnaise, yes, but it is not the only thing that I love. And because I had free reign and access to it, I actually had the luxury to figure out when and where I wanted it. And over the course of about a month, I stopped binging on this and a jar lasted me a reasonable amount of time. I kind of equate this process to being like you're a teenager who grew up in a really restrictive household, who goes to college and then they go a little nuts. It takes some time of going nuts before you're able to regulate and decide what it is you actually want in your life. And the thing is, if mayonnaise is not scarce, if the times I have it in my house are not the only times I can have access to it, then you're able to actually decide when and where you do want it, as opposed to needing to capitalize on it when the opportunity presents itself. Because when we decide that there's something virtuous from abstaining from foods like this, and we let these foods have that level of power over us, in all likelihood, the more and more you try to control this, the more and more you're going to beat up on yourself, and the further away from control we actually get. This is a scary process, but you have to ask yourself, was the approach you were doing before working? Like, in reality, was it working? Or were you just struggling, binging, and then beating yourself up afterwards because you can't do the very simple task of not letting the foods come into the home? We often judge the efficacy of an approach with the results that we would see if we were able to execute it perfectly. But we never stop to evaluate if it is possible for us to execute it perfectly in the first place. We often don't view our results as actual results because we are so trained to view ourselves as the problem. If an approach isn't working, it's because we are the problem. It is not because the approach doesn't work for us. So if you have trigger foods, pick one food and commit to having it in your house at all times. In fact, have more of it in your house than you could possibly eat in one setting, because that is going to prevent you from trying to eat the rest of it to get it out of the house. Know that you will most likely eat way too much of it at first, and that is okay. That is part of the process of rebuilding trust in yourself. Rebuilding trust in your body's cues is tricky business, and it can feel really scary and insecure. So if you are interested in this approach, but you feel like you need some support and guidance in this process, don't hesitate to reach out to me. There is a link in the description box below.